this is really excited to talk today about, the changing your strategies for digital transformation in clinical trials. We've got a great team here, different people that have come together to really show what we're doing within clinical trials. I'll go through these real quick and then we'll get started. This is a panel discussion. I hope you enjoy it. It allows us to get different opinions of what's going on, what you're hearing from different companies, and really ask questions at the end. So got a great set of panelists here. We've got Roz Hargraf, who is coming to us from Medable. He's basically one of the great panelists here. You'll hear more from him around that. And then we have David Blackman, who's from Oracle. And basically, David is going to be talking about the digital trials pieces from the Oracle Health Sciences. And then Brian Hill, who's coming to us from Cognizant, the CTO over there on health and innovation. So very excited to have this panel here today. Thanks for joining us today. And I want to thank all the different people joining to listen to us and hear more about it. And we're excited to talk more about this. So let's go ahead and get started as we go through. So thanks again to the panelists, and we'll move forward. The state of the industry, just to get us started, talking about where we are with the state of the industry. We really have to look at that, what's going on, and you see this these different numbers here, and this came from a survey just conducted by Informa Intelligence with Oracle sponsoring it to really see what approaches organizations took to implement during the pandemic. 40% of the organizations said they did remote monitoring, 37% they did video visits, 35% did phone visits. Really, these are remote, monitoring, and how do we access these sites remotely? Then we start to see 28% implemented some e-consent, 26% EHRs, 23% patient apps. There was home healthcare visits, 20%. 19% did mobile health and web wearables. 19% did central monitoring. 19% did central labs. eCOA, 18%. ePro, 18%. And then local labs, 18%, and 15% in eSource. And only 10% didn't implement any new approaches. So when we start looking at this, everyone during the pandemic had to do something. And I think it was important to see how did that kickstart. We came out of an innovation phase with digital trials into let's get this moving because we had to. And, a lot comes around that, right? It is really understanding, where we are today and how did this really drive us to change. And what does that mean for the future is really what we need to look at. That transformation of best practices, of education, investment, and scalability. So now that we've been using these technologies, we've been using many of them for years, it's now what are the challenges? Because now we have to look at it and say, how do we scale this? There are many things that need to be looked at. And I'm gonna move this over to Brian to really to give us some more feedback first on, what was the pivoting during this pandemic and what was the reasoning of it? Brian?
Yeah, thanks. So I think it's interesting, one, the numbers that you shared, Jim, what we've seen, one of the numbers was, basically 90% of folks are trying something, but then you see small, sort of 20%, 18%, 10% in the different areas of, digital technologies or methods. I think that's what we see, is that we're seeing experimentation or full exercises in certain areas, whether it be e-consent or what have you. But I think from a challenge perspective, part of what we see is a trust in technology. Are we going to get the same accuracy or integrity of data outside of a clinical setting using technologies? Can we trust participants to use those technologies effectively? And then the other thing is really around change management. Another thing that we see often within organizations over the last 18 months to 2 years, really even longer than the pandemic, is essentially SWAT teams, or specialized units that are set up to explore some of these new technologies, how they might be deployed, for individual studies, therapeutic categories or, leveraged across a portfolio of work. What's challenging is, we may experiment within a subset of the portfolio, 3 trials, 5, 6 trials, whatever it may be, how that, the progress gets communicated to the broader organization, different organizations that now need to adopt these, from ClinOps to other groups. That's where we see some of the breakdowns, right? Where you may have non-believers. We've always done it this way, so we can't do it any other way. And again, I go back to the levels of trust of technology and these kinds of things, and human behavior to use technology effectively. Again, how stuff gets communicated, the planning, the training, and continued communication and reinforcement around successes and learnings, that's one of the biggest things that we've seen.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think we've all experienced that. So, and I'm going to turn this over to Raz around the data collection piece and surfacing the data and those challenges during this and the pitfalls that we've seen. And again, I'll start off. We always experience pitfalls when we implement something new. Give us a little perspective on that, Raz.
Thank you so much, James. Well, I think it's always hard to be a beginner, right? And nobody saw this pandemic really, take the pace that we have seen now. I remember, literally half a year ago, I visited US for the first time in 1 year, right? And I was used to travel around. So I think this is a whole industry, a whole world in different kind of industries where we really saw that we really needed to think out of the box, right? We are all linked into our first and foremost highest prioritization is to keep people safe, right? And how can we do that? And we have seen in many other industries where they have adopting this technology. The internet, we have seen, internet has been rapidly growing, so we have a stable internet connection, even though now we have seen still people joining in different kind of platforms where they are lacking, they are forgetting to use unmute, mute, etc. So I think these things is nothing new right now. It's just a matter of how we see the adoption curve being adopted into different kind of organizations. And first and foremost, why we are conducting clinical studies is to bring new novel treatments to the market, to people who are suffering from diseases. And they are having a dream. Every day they're wishing for having better treatment, right? And to have better treatment go to market, we need to collect high quality data. And what we've seen so far is that we can utilize technology to collect data that we have never seen before. We can collect more real-time data supporting real-time evidence. We can also go in and support that we have diverse data collection in our clinical studies. I read an article 2 months ago where they estimated that only 4% of the human population are attending clinical research. We need to set bigger ambitions. It should be a right for everybody to have access to clinical research because in the very end, it will bring better treatment to the market.
Real quick, Ramses, around that, with the surfacing the data, what does that mean? And that's the other piece. We can collect all this new data, but how do we surface it? And I don't mean from the collection point of view, but how about from the site's perspective? Anything you want to add around that?
I think, also what we've seen so far today, we cannot do it alone. And it's a great point, James, right? We need to stand together, Cognizant, Oracle, Medable in this case, right? And that is also where we can really see site as a partner. How can we support them in collection of data? And basically, when you are utilizing new technology and you can literally collect many data points, how do you ensure that you collect the right data points? And one of my statistic professors at medical school told me, well, when you collect data, there's no going back. You need to collect the right data here and now because you cannot just simulate the data going forward in the future.
No, makes sense. Thanks, Raz. And David, so elaborating on that, this data, right? We have to look at the clinical and the ClinOps pieces and bringing that data together, unifying, we just heard Raz say about unifying the DCT and the site-based clinical. What does that mean? I mean that sounds simple, but I don't think we have a lot of that today.
Yeah, I think, Jim, and that's a great question. That in itself, it's the opportunity and the challenge that I think we really all need to deal with. And if you look at the data points that you showed out, there's COVID catalyzation of what we've seen in digital and decentralized capabilities driving this rapid, I don't want to call it maturity, but more adoption from these individual components, really helping keep studies running, helping keep sites open. But fundamentally on the back end of that, the commitment to scale and putting the operational efficiency drivers to build scale around these capabilities is, I think, where we've struggled a little bit. And take a search of the internet and say, what were my biggest clinical research challenges? It's going to be less about the technology that was used and really more about how did you operationalize and execute that study? So take things like, clinical trial management. There's been a significant under-focus in that. So as we look at the application of new technologies, they need to focus on supporting the management of the study. How do we surface the right data to the right study participant at the right time? I think as you'll hear us talking through our discussion today on what we as Oracle, with Cognizant, with our friends at Medable are trying to do, is really unlock the value of the execution of clinical research, not just the collection of the data. How do we present this data as one unified single source of truth that you can really truly start putting advanced analytics, smart intelligence to gain some of these earlier insights and better insights?
Yeah, great. So that kind of brings me to the next thought that I have around, all right, so we have all these things and we're introducing them, and I kind of heard the maturity pieces. We're not mature yet, right? We're still learning how do we use these in our clinical trials. So how do we start to change, and how do we get these best practices out there? And Raz, I'm going to turn it over to you first around the education, right? What does that mean to get out there and get people so that they understand what this means and how to do it?
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you so much, James. I think, we need to learn to speak another language and to communicate right, to have a framework. How do we see the new way of conducting clinical studies, right? And that was where we at Medable said, okay, how can we help our clients to really see where the value is? And that was the reason why we launched the Medical Academy, right? Because we needed to go down and learn the language of DCT. I think from a personal perspective, I think right now DCT is just a working title. I think this has come to be the general, how we conduct clinical studies going forward, right? But right now we're just using DCT as a working title. So I think it's critical for us that we know how we can transform the GCP into DCT and how we can operate that going forward. And that is the reason why education is a critical part in that, from the very, from CRAs to project managers, sponsors, sites, etc. Again, we cannot do it alone, so we need to communicate in the stable language and have that framework in place.
It brings up a good point, because I do hear about, when you get into different meetings, some people refer to digital trials, some people refer to DCT, some people are, the ePro, they call, all the different things. We saw the things above like ePro and eConsent, but, it is a hard thing to try to bring together when you're talking to people. You've got to clarify it right up front. But we do need to educate people, and I think there's a lot of good organizations coming around that are starting to do that, and companies like yours that have brought them to the forefront. And part of that is, how do we commit, right? We use the word digital, right? We use the word DCT. They're kind of the same thing. That DCT is using digital trials to be able to be decentralized, right? That's one way to put it. But we also have to commit, right? And I think, it's a lot of people. You talked about educating people, and I'm going to call on Brian to talk a little bit about how do we commit to that investment? What is it to make that change and to make the things digital centric as a company, and what are the things around that we should think about?
Yeah, I just, before I'll address that, but I think, Raz makes some really great points that I think for everyone in the audience, the key to society is a common language, right? so that we can have a common understanding and we can start to move forward and innovate and do interesting things. We can start to establish these best practices. The work that DTRA is doing, the Medical Academy, some of the things that DIME is doing around devices and sort of the applicability of those within these environments, clinical environments. Really important work. I mention all that as I talk about the commitment because I think organizations in this space in life sciences need to be part of the conversation, right? There are going to be unique needs, the kinds of methods and needs of a specialty rare disease trial versus, chronic disease, diabetes, what have you, are going to be different. And we want to make sure that we're accounting for all these variables as much as we can as we establish those best practices. So part of the commitment is that we are going to move forward in this decentralized way, and Raz and I are aligned on, I think we're going to be to the point soon where things like decentralized just go away, and it's clinical trials, and the tools and methods that you use and deploy really define, uniquely what that experience is going to be like for a given trial or participant. But it is going to come with an investment. Some of that investment within the organization is going to be, let's be tactical, creating, training collateral for, different folks within the organization so that everyone has a common understanding of what DCT means within their org and how it connects to the broader industry. How, one sponsor may work with, a technology vendor, CRO, or other technology systems integrators like Cognizant in this way. We all need to be communicating about this, using the same language, communicating the same way in order to progress. And again, so there may be some upfront investment in how you do that within the business, but the goals and the impact are going to be significant, right? And we need to look at how much is this going to accelerate trial timelines for our organization, for a portion of our portfolio. What's the longer-term economic impact of that? How is this going to impact, the accuracy of data and the efficiency with the way we work that will ultimately make this safer for folks who are participating in clinical research?
So Brian, I'm going to throw you an interesting question here. If I said, you looked at it and you mentioned a lot of different ways. If I'm sitting in the business or if I'm sitting in IT, how does this come together, right? We've gone through this transformation of, we've moved to the cloud and now things are business oriented, but we've heard a lot, it's digital, there's technology, there's understanding how these bring together. Is that going to change, the investment strategy with, business and IT? Do they come back together? What does that mean?
They have to come together. And I think fundamentally to make any of this work, I've spoken about this a lot publicly, but let's start with an understanding of what digital is. Digital is not technology. Digital is a bridge between human need and technology. And what that bridge is comprised of is design, content, connectivity, interactions, all these kinds of things. So when we talk about digital in terms of clinical research, you've got to think about that. In order to orchestrate that, you need vision and an organizational structure that's going to support it, where you don't have business and IT, but you actually have a unified approach to delivering something for the business. And that comes with structural changes within the organization, clear line of accountability, in our terms within Cognizant, and where I lead digital health, we call them digital health showrunners. Thinking about it in terms of individuals and people who actually run this kind of work that have a perspective across the business domain and human needs, as well as the technology, right? And teams that then support that and work together, in integrated models. That's a fundamental shift, right?
Okay, no, it makes sense. No, and I think people have to be prepared to look at those shifts. Absolutely. And David, I'm going to turn it over to you a little bit, because as we look at this, we talked about maturity a little bit already, right? But, maturity leads to scalability, right? How do we get this industry so that it can scale, right? So that it, as we heard from both Brian and from Roz, that this isn't something that sits in this incubator status or in this let's try it status, to how do we really make it part of our day-to-day, and digital's just how we run trials. I don't know, David, you add some.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you heard from Rasmus' comments, from Brian's comments, there's a lot of dimensions to scalability, and the technology is just one part of it. It's about having the right educated, skilled resources and patients who, combined with the right technology, are truly going to unlock the value of using decentralized and digital methodologies in your studies. But if you look at today, a lot of the innovation and the alternatives that we provide with decentralized clinical trials really focus on segmented data capture, whether that's directly from the patient, whether it's through an intermediary. And I think we have an opportunity to really break down some of those gates and barriers on how do we real-time engage with the patient and essentially unify the patient and data flow together. But to understand sort of where you're going, I think you need to understand where you are and what challenges that you are predominantly in our system today. And there's probably three key areas I like to think of. And the first one, of course, is this increased increased trial time and cost component, which fundamentally we're all trying a solution for. To me, sitting where at Oracle, we're able to provide some kind of change and differentiation here. Is that focus on these segmented technologies and the complex workflows that we believe are at the forefront of extending the time and the cost of trials, and also resolving the data collection, synergy, and monitoring. Back to my earlier point about decentralized or direct from patient data and patients collected from an intermediary are often really seen in autonomy, and I think we have an opportunity to bring those together and help drive scale efficiently. I think the second component, falls a lot more into what partners like Medable are able to achieve around that patient access, patient diversity, so reduction in burden, broader access, broader geographic reach, and certainly the ongoing engagement of patients in studies. But we need to bring that same focus through the data that we're collecting through to study participants, whether that's societies, clinical coordination. And then I think the third one is understanding that methodologies, capabilities, cannot come at the cost of additional complexity in operational models. It's going to gate scale significantly. We have this opportunity with DCT real time, have data that's collected from a patient or from an intermediary to be collected and unified and displayed. I think from our view, we are saying that what does the ecosystem look like that provides to the study in its entirety a single source of truth in the data that's going to allow that continuous, deep analysis and interrogation of the data, better remote monitoring, surfacing extracts, but most importantly, I think unlocking operational and data management challenges that we see today. Now, improving the patient experience, I think that's critical. We've got to keep our eye on that ball as well. But I think efficiently operationalizing the collection, the management of the data, irrespective of the modality and the source of that data, is where there's a true opportunity that we truly can impact.
Okay.
Back over to you.
Thanks, Tim. So I'm going to throw a question around this, and I'm going to ask each of you to answer it from a different perspective. I'm going to have Brian, you answer it from a sponsor's point of view. David, you're going to answer it from a site's point of view, and then over to Roz, I'm going to ask you to answer it from a patient's point of view. So we talked about, all these changes and transformation pieces. What's the number one obstacle you've seen over the last couple of years or the last 2 years with this for these changes? What's the biggest obstacle that they're running into at this point when they do this? I'll start with you, Brian, with the sponsor's point of view.
Yeah. I mean, I'll reiterate some of the things that I mentioned earlier in the discussion. I think, how, where there are efforts within the organization, within a sponsor organization to start to adopt some of these tools, how that gets communicated the change management within the organization to drive broader adoption and scale across the portfolio, that change management component has been a challenge. The other, I would say, is a fragmented approach to data. So Raz mentioned this earlier when he was talking about data visibility and such. And at the end of the day, we're expanding the collection of data, the points of data collection, the types of data that we're collecting, the volume and velocity. So how all of that comes into the organization and insights are derived, right? We're not collecting information, digital biomarkers or what have you every couple of weeks. It's daily, maybe it's multiple times per day. And again, it's a simplistic example, but how we then start to synthesize that, if you've got data in different areas, right, in different silos, if you will, then you can't effectively start to build the visualization tools and more advanced techniques of machine learning and AI to start to identify signals and these kinds of things, which could ultimately drive things like adaptive designs and these kinds of things, right? So I think that data, centralizing the data bit is one, and then again, change management within organizations to start to more broadly adopt these methods.
Awesome. No, I completely agree. And David, your thought from a site's perspective, what's their biggest challenges?
I think the biggest one, if I were to put it in one phrase, is the complexity of adding additional segmented technologies, right, whether they direct from patient models or other, but we're speaking about DCT today. So it's really that complexity. And I think there are a number of dimensions on that. It's being able to mitigate patient insight, inability and willingness to use these new different technologies and capabilities. And I think the onus is on us who provide this technology to make sure that it is simple and usable enough that it's not a gate to adoption. I think some of the support models are areas around that complexity of technology where we essentially have uneducated patient and site cohorts that we need to be able to support. So it ties into education, but there's a tier 2, which is how do you provide that support model as well. And then I think a big part of that as well is the study conduct team's familiarity with collecting and using data that's collected directly from patients, and I try to the understanding of that data and what does it mean for them, and how can they impact change. So as we think about putting some of these methodologies and processes in place, I think there's maybe 3 areas that I would think about. The first one that we need to be very clear on our value proposition to a study is saying, does using this DCT practice or methodology meet my study objectives? What are the impact to my protocol if it's an existing or a future protocol? And a clear understanding of how for all participants, especially this side, how is the data collected, interrogated, and what does it mean to them? I think the second of all is to ensure the sites that using these new methodologies is going to provide a higher level of certainty, right? It's going to give you a deeper level of engagement with your patient. It's going to surface real-time information. And then I think the third one is to make sure, as I said before, that adoption of new technologies and ways of doing this is really not additive. It needs to reduce the burden on people who are very busy in trying to conduct trials today.
I think that last one's important, and I guess that brings it over to you, Raz, around, are we making it easier for the patient? What is it for the patient? Are we hitting obstacles there?
Yeah, and I absolutely love that David called people, right? They're not only patients, they're people, they're people suffering from a disease, right? And in the very end, even though that you are considered a competitor, etc., investigating new treatments for the same, same TA, we are on the same mission, all of us. We are dedicated to bring better treatment to the market, right? And I think we need to remember when we are writing protocols, when we are doing site initiations, when we are doing site qualifications, there are people in the very end, with families. There is a dad, maybe terminal ill, right? who is waiting for this, right? So I think to all these kind of things, it's just a matter of, the 4 bullet points we have in front of us right now. It's a matter of educating, communicating the best practice. What do we expect from the participant when they are deciding to invest, not money, but their time in a clinical study? How do we educate them? What do we see so they generate the trust? How can we ensure them that we are literally supporting them from GCP? Remember, GCP is safety first, then efficacy, right? And that is where we can really utilize the technology, collecting the data, and to the point that Brian highlighted here, it's a matter of tearing down the silos, collecting the data at the same place, because that is where we can utilize machine learning, etc. And finally, what I was alluding to before, the diversity. I think it's horrible to know that there are places in this very developed world we are living in on this planet Earth, right, where they don't have communications, where they cannot take part in studies, because basically we are made of the same genome, right, and we all want the best quality of life in the very end. So if we can just lower people who are living with a chronic, pain, right? If we can bring treatments to the market where they can lower their pain for, let's say, 20, 30%, we have made a massive impact. Maybe we have made that dad able to play with their kids, etc. So long story short, I definitely believe in people experience. And this is not only patients, it is from the study nurse, it's the study coordinator, the PI, the PM, the PC, all the people who are involved in this fantastic industry that we are representing today, right? We're on the same mission and we're doing extraordinary job right now. And I think, I wrote down here, for every crisis that we are experiencing, there is opportunities. And I really believe that we have rebranded the pharmaceutical industry because we have really stood together here trying to find a good way out of this pandemic. And I think what we will see here by utilizing technology, the collaborations that we are seeing today, right? How can we bring down the burden, make it in a better user experience? And I really believe that that will bring a whole new way, a whole new framework in terms of how we think, design, and conduct clinical studies going forward. So that is also the reason why we are honored to be part of this panel representing Medable and to see how we can tear down the bridge, bring the bridges across the industry. It's all a matter, we're talking about interoperability, right? We need to operate together when we're talking about not only technology, also us as healthcare professionals.
Awesome. Well, that's good, Ramses. I think it brings us to the next piece here is, we've talked about, Oracle, Medable, and Cognizant and working together. You mentioned a little bit there. And, in that partnership and what does that mean? And I think I've heard the experiences across the pieces here. David, can you talk a little bit about this partnership and why is this coming about and what does this do?
Yeah, Jim, thank you. And at the forefront, I think to truly unlock the promise of what ability to engage directly with patients in a clinical trial is going to be, you need to understand the service that each of the providers are going to be providing. Ultimately, what we're trying to do, and Rasmus highlighted it so well, is we're trying to service our patient cohort and make trials available to all. But at the same time, we have a responsibility to focus on efficiency, simplicity, non-additive around technology. When you look at what Oracle, Medable, and Cognizant are collaboratively able to do together, I think we focus on 3 very strong value propositions in addition to others. The first one is we're going to broaden that access to all patients in the right way. The second one is reducing the time it takes to bring these life-saving drugs to patients and the associated cost that comes with that, because time and cost are so closely aligned together. And then the third one is to really look at how do we get a better form and quality of data than we get today. If you look outside of health sciences industry, the adoption and interrogation of data is significantly more mature than what we're able to do. And part of that's not a desire from health scientists and researchers to have that broader level of adoption. It's tied around the complexity of and the regulatory requirements around how do you collect and manage that data. So I think, you know, as we looked and sort of think about what partnerships would unlock some of those, and seeking out these best-in-class flexible solutions that address data collection, data interrogation, and management of a study, we were looking for partners that were going to be able to help us collaboratively do that. You know, we have a statement over here. It's around enabling enhanced access to patients, and then an operationalization component to truly bring the value of your studies. From our perspective, we know what we're good at, right? We are good at accumulating and interrogating and surfacing data, you know, and we know what that's going to mean for the sites as we provide them enhanced, unprecedented insights, real-time as real-time can be, into how their patients and the overall study and their contribution is. And we understand very strongly what companies like Medable and their direct engagement with patients looks like and why that's so critical to a study. And then we understand how a partner like Cognizant can come along and really look broadly and holistically at how we execute and deliver this study and bring some of the best practices, which I think still have to be unlocked from using some of these new capabilities and technologies.
Yeah, great, David. And Brian, anything you want to add to that? Because I think that this partnership that you know we're talking about here brings together, you know, technology and process. I don't know if you can add anything to that.
Yeah. So you know, at the end of the day, what we want when we talk about, there's a theme to this, right, around digital transformation. It's not digital translation. We don't want to just take paper processes or analog processes and then, you know, take paper, turn it into a PDF. That's not digital transformation. But if we can look at the process, look at what a technology may provide to us as far as an accelerator, look at maybe, you know, certain behaviors and look at data to see if there are ways that we can drive efficiency in process and do re-engineering, that can have a dramatic impact on the overall efficiency. And in order to do that, you need to have this ecosystem. There's been a lot of discussion around ecosystems, but you truly need to have an ecosystem perspective. What you see in front of us here on this slide is, you know, different actors, different communities, right? And within those communities, different sub-communities. Their preference, their behavior, their motivations are all going to be unique, and we need to deploy the technology, Oracle, Medable, et cetera, so that it suits those needs. So the perspective that we bring as a partner is one where, as a systems integrator, yes, we will have, you know, we're enabled, we know how to use this technology and stand it up and configure it to the needs of an individual business, study, et cetera. But it's also then looking at, from a human perspective, you know, whether it's ethnography, anthropologists, designers, human-centered design approaches, to actually then think about that experience holistically, including process reengineering, including design and how we actually make these things look and feel, not only for patients. You know, a lot has been said around patient centricity. And the reality is that all of this change for patients or participants or people, as, you know, David and Raz said, and I agree with, you know, well, researchers, you know, site coordinators, investigators, they're people too. How are we looking at transforming their experience in a meaningful way, and then ensuring that it connects, you know, effectively? So, you know, again, just some additional thoughts on building on some of the comments David made.
And, you know, again, you hear it, people, the process, and the data, right? All those things are coming together. And, you know, Raz, I'll give you a little chance to answer this here. But in this partnership, we're bringing the site, the sponsor, and the patient together. And, you know, one of the systems we're using is the Oracle Clinical One to bring that together where the sites and the sponsors can see everything together. But an important part of that is what Medable is providing, you know, on top of what, you know, the process of the integration process of bringing together that we heard from Brian, but what's your thoughts on how the three of the teams working together can really, enhance a sponsor's implementation? What is it, the lessons learned, the experience? What are those things that you want to mention around that from a medical's perspective?
I will say again, there's nobody in this industry that can do this alone. We are connected in somehow, right? And everything that I do in my life, I focus on synergies. And I think it's very, very clear looking in here, site, patient, sponsor, CROs, how we can connect these people together, the end users together. We have our Chief Design Officer, Sina, and we believe in human-centered design, right? How can we humanize the design, make it so intuitive, so it is very easy to use, right? So when I describe the medical platform and how we really want to enable the whole industry is coming from Denmark, so using the terminology of Lego, I consider, the medical as Lego blocks, where it is so intuitive to build your study. It should not take months, years to build. When you have that, you can simulate, you can build it, you can deploy it, right? Again, many people, this is critical time. I heard that David was saying, we have quality, time, and price, and you cannot have everything, right? So how can you go in and reduce the time, but not reduce the quality? And that is really where we can see the partnership here, where we can support the change management. We can collect the data real time at the patient by not creating another burden. We can involve and enable sites, and we can harvest that data and collect that directly into the Oracle Clinical Run, right? I think this, the whole pathway in terms of how we collect the data is critical, and that is the reason why to see these pillars and how we can collaborate is crucial.
Awesome. No, that's good. Well, we're kind of running out of time. I'm going to give you each of a minute to kind of wrap up what your thoughts are after we've talked about this and the partnership over in general. And I'll start with David, and then I'll work my way to Raz and Brian. So go ahead, David.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Jim. And as we look to what the future of decentralized and digital research is going to be, from Oracle's perspective, we really are very much focused on building the right partnerships that help bring in the correct data from patients and sites and intermediaries into our Clinical One ecosystem. Where our focus is very much going to be at that point is what do we do with that data? How do we service that data or serve that data up for all of our participants? We have, I think, with how we've built our architecture and technology, this very unique position where we will be able to provide that single source of truth data, this unified data. So irrespective of what the data source is, we are able to aggregate and act on that data within our DCT Clinical One ecosystem. I think partnerships with Medable, with Cognizant, for example, are really going to be very symbiotic in aligning the journey of the patient and the investigator through the study with the data flow that's collected, and then our onus on what do we do with that data afterwards.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Raz, your opinion, closing comments.
Yeah, final comments. Well, firstly, we are excited to take part in this panel, right? We are excited about the partnership here, but most and foremost, we are excited that we see more participants take part in the study, right? I read today, no place like home, and I completely support that. No place like home, that is where you can go around, be yourself. And be yourself is also tied into real-time data collection, right? We can also see passive collection, and maybe we are just seeing a new way of how we can, make this kind of data stream going in, and maybe we can use that. I believe it was you, Brian, who was talking about digital biomarkers. We're also talking about digital therapeutics, etc. And I think we will be seeing more and more things in a hybrid setting. We have talked about hybrid decentralized clinical trials, etc. But we will also see devices compared together with the compounds, and we will see a much more disruption taking place in terms of how we are thinking general health. how can we go in and measure general health before we are developing a disease, etc. And I think that is also where we can utilize the data and seeing this change management that is taking place right now. How can we start to act more proactive instead of reactively? And that is really where what we want to be. We really want to facilitate health, right? And we are in a very lucky position because we saw with an Everest assessment that what is the first and foremost that we are looking into in this industry is user experience. So how can we ensure the greatest user experience so they're not biased and we are not taking critical time out of their life? Because basically time is the most valuable thing that you have in this life. So we really want to bring good data, collaborate across the industry, and that is a brilliant way to be part in this panel discussion today.
Awesome. And Brian, I'm going to let you close it out from a comment point of view.
Yeah, batting cleanup. No, listen, agree with, Raz, David, all, obviously we're all aligned. That's what makes our partnership work so well. But what I would say is, for our part, we want to continue to build out, advisory capabilities, scale around enabling these technologies and standing up these environments with our client, within our client environments and things like this. I think also, really focusing on, as Raz was saying, the experience and making sure that is, we're doing things in an elegant way, right? That we're taking some of the norms that we have in our daily lives and starting to adopt those into this clinical environment, right? When you think about, I talk about, the Apple experience as we sit here and talk. I'm participating in a couple of, observational studies. How can it be that sort of easy for folks to participate in more of an interventional environment? I think that's where, some of the things that we're doing together start to bring more of that to life.
Great. All right. Thanks, Brian. And I want to thank the panelists, Brian, Raz, and David, around this whole conversation. I think I've learned a little bit. I hope all of the, at least the participants have learned a little bit together. And I think this collaboration between the three companies shows how we have to work together, right? And how we have to take all these things. And if we're going to expand this, we're going to really get this out to the industry. We have to look at that. So I do want to remind all the attendees that if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. There's a chat button in there. I think we've already been through that earlier today. I know there's a couple questions in there today that we have. So I know we'll go through that. The first question that came through is, how do you support participants to ensure effective use of digital tools and data collection outside of the clinical setting? Which one of you would like to take a stab at that first?
I'll give a perspective, and certainly want to hear from my fellow panelists here. But I think this is a huge unmet need today. I think we are equipping people with wearables, apps, and technology. There's user situations where you may lose Bluetooth connectivity, you may have a gap in data collection, and how do you address those issues that may be more technical in nature, right? And how do you build a support ecosystem where you think about, again, I look at parallels to daily life. If your app, your PowerPoint crashes on your machine, you get a little error report. You want to send this off to Apple or Microsoft or what have you, and you do that, and now that goes into the developer sort of pipeline to address a bug fix, right? You need those kinds of paradigms built in to the apps and services that we're deploying. You also need the ability to support patients with really intuitive, knowledge bases and self-help kinds of solutions, whether that's how-to videos to set up your new, digital technologies that are going to enable you to participate in the wild, or issue resolution where you can look up and try to resolve an issue on your own. And ultimately, if you can't do that on your own, that you can access a live expert to help walk you through and resolve that issue, all the while auditing all of that so that you're informing your development backlog as a technology provider, and informing your overall sort of product backlog, your innovation backlog for new features and things in the future.
Yeah.
Again,
Awesome.
think more like Apple and Best Buy in those support environments versus maybe what exists today.
No, that makes sense. All right. Roz, anything you want to add, or David? I'll give you, you raised your hand, Roz.
Yeah, you're spot on, Brian. You know, just see how many apps you have on your smartphone right now and how many of them you're using, right? We are seeing people who are, you know, being some kind of notification fatigue, so they don't respond on the notifications, right? So it's all a matter of, you know, bringing the value to the end user, also the user experience, right? So it's very much about how you are making your UX in place. And likewise, you know, to have a proper onboarding, it is critical. So when you launch this, they know what is expected and how they can take an active part.
And Roz, there was a question a little bit earlier around, you mentioned the word medical academy. Is this site-facing or patient-facing, and how is this structured to the local digital data?
Yeah, maybe it was my mic that was not good. It is called the Medable Academy, so not Medical Academy, so Medable Academy. And yeah, it is supporting the whole ecosystem, both site sponsors, CROs, that we are literally just making this kind of academy where you can take, you know, these kind of certifications and being educated, trained in terms of the best practices. So basically equipping people with the knowledge, skill set, not only on the Medable platform, but just in general, because again, to what I was alluding to in the very start, we need to speak the same language before we can collaborate. So that is the whole, you know, goal of Medable Academy.
Awesome. That sounds great. I'll have to sign up for it. The other piece around there is, David, I'm going to ask you to answer this one. How do you manage local level digital data intel? A knowledge base of e-signature requirements, all those pieces. How do you manage all that? The patient email use, the data storage, GDPR pieces. You know, it's still evolving, right? And I think, you know, it's difficult to know from country to country. So we can start with you, David, but how do you manage all this?
Yeah, I mean, Jim, that question, I think, in some ways is probably a little bit better geared to Rasmus, but I'll have a stab at it first. You know, I think it's making sure that you are have the right regulatory focus on data collection. It's being like we are at Oracle involved in different industry groups which are trying to influence the collection of data and how global regulators see the value and how that data is collected, interrogated as part of a clinical study. And then I think the third one is a part of what we're talking about today, is understanding that you have a flexible partner ecosystem with partners that are able to provide services fit for the protocol, and understanding, I think Rasmus brought that up more than once, you can't be everything to everybody. So, you know, as we in Clinical One try to do, right, remain agnostic to how the data is collected, but ensuring that flexibility is not at the expense of complexity for participants. So making sure that our partners are very aligned with the right and the best ways to collect this data, and to be advising our customers as protocols and studies are built out on what you can do in country with decentralized and digital components, and what still has to go through an intermediary. The way that Clinical One has been designed, at the end of the day, if a data point is collected, a consent is collected through, for example, the Medable platform, that the record of that consent, the version, the date, the patient ID for that matter, is all real-time surfaced as a single source of truth in Clinical One. If that same pathway to be followed in ex-US, in a country that doesn't allow that digital signature, the consenting can be done at an intermediary site and populated into Clinical One. There's no duplication of entry. There's no duplication of record. It's about not bringing complexity at the cost of the expense of flexibility, I think.
Okay. Either of you want to add anything, Brian or Russ?
I can add a short comment. We are short on time here, but a great question. Luckily, we have seen also related to this pandemic that FDA and EMA is starting to share best practices, so we can definitely learn from each other. I don't think that there is a European continent and a US continent and African continent. I think we're on the same planet, right? So it should be utilized general. So I think we will see a more general set of rules in terms of how we are handling data privacy related to the e-signature, etc. I will just highlight that I consider informed consent as much more than just a signature. It's much more about how you inform, educate, and ensure that the end user know what they're signing up for. You will also see a major impact in terms of the retention when that is communicated well, because well-informed participants are highly engaged. And the ROI of DCT, of course, this is an investment you are doing right now, but a clear ROI related to this, I think it's the reconsent and the whole storage of consent. Remember, you need to store all the documentation, and when that is stored on the cloud, it's much easier to do, audits, monitoring, etc. Right? So I see definitely a clear ROI, but of course it takes an investment to take that step into that area of the digitalization.
Well, we're at the top of the hour. I want to thank Raz, from the Medable side. I then want to thank Brian from Cognizant. I also want to thank David from Oracle. I learned a lot. Hopefully the attendees did. I know there's a few questions we haven't been able to answer. We'll definitely send those back out to the participants so we have answers to you. And we want to thank you guys. This was very informative. I learned a lot. Again, I think these are the things that we have to bring together to really, create the ecosystem that works together and looks at it holistically of how do we transform this industry. So great time here today, and thanks again for everyone who attended today.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Be well.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.